Hi, I'm Tim. Welcome to Watch One, and thanks for logging on. Today I've got a real treat for you. Yes, it's available for immediate purchase and delivery on our website, watchyouwant.com, but on our YouTube channel, Watch You Want Inc., I'm ready to debut our first ever encounter with the Halter-Barnes Antiqua. Better known as the Vianney Halter Antiqua, this model, approximately 40 millimeters in diameter, 18 karat rose gold, is one of two watches that I believe represent the birth of the modern era of high horology. On the watchmaking and engineering side, it was the 1986 to 1991 Audemars Piguet Tourbillon 1, the first serially produced tourbillon wristwatch ever. But on the aesthetic side, the watch that changed our idea of what a luxury watch, even an ultra haut-de-gamme watch, could look like, was the 1998 to present Halter-Barnes, later Vianney Halter Antiqua, the watch that you see here. Now, this is a rare sight, even for me, and I deal with top-of-the-market luxury watches on a daily basis. This is the first one I've ever seen, much less held in my hand. But what I found in most online photography of these watches is a lack of context. Watches like this are such rock stars that they're rarely photographed with anything to give a frame of reference. Online imagery is heavy on studio photography and composition, staged shots, not so much wrist shots. So you can see on my wrist, 6 1/3 inches, 16 centimeters in circumference. The Antiqua actually reads considerably different than you might expect. It's not an overwhelming mechanical monstrosity. While steampunk is the operative term, and I'll get to a little bit more of that in a moment, it's certainly not built in the proportions of a locomotive or a traction engine from the 19th century. Really, it's actually quite fine. With an ultra-thin, automatic winding mechanical movement, it's also approximately the size of a normal 40 millimeter round watch on the wrist, and that's due to the fact that the actual round portion of the watch, as well as the round portion of the dial on which the subdials are mounted, is in fact 40 millimeters. Now these splayed out hinged lugs allow the watch to clear even the smallest of wrists with ease, and it wears with a lightness that's, quite frankly, shocking. I never expected the watch to be this discreet or this delicate in its detailing, but it truly is. It's a masterpiece in many respects. First of all, the inspiration and the art design, but also the execution in such compact dimensions. Now you can see that it really does play nicely on a smaller wrist. It's only about 10 millimeters thick at the base that holds the subdials, but you can see that, like a gauge cluster on a vintage machine, and by vintage machine I mean an old Baldwin locomotive, each one of the individual gauges is of a different diameter but also of a different height, and each one cantilevers out a little bit from the case flanks. Much like the turrets on a 19th century battleship or cruiser, it's almost like it has its own separate set of barbettes mounted on the sides of its hull. The imagery here is definitely what they call futur antérieur, or the idea of the past envisioning the future. Not so much Jules Verne and not so much H.G. Wells, because they were futurists in the strictest sense, trying to be predictive and convincing, persuasive in their vision of the future, making their best efforts at describing what a fantastical future might look like given the technologies that existed at their time. Now the idea embodied in the Antiqua, designed by Jeff Barnes, an industrial designer, and executed by Vianney Halter, the actual artisan, this is the idea of looking at the future through the lens of the past, combining almost anachronism and futurism into one entity. That's what the futur antérieur really means. Not an effort to emulate Jules Verne or H.G. Wells or the past science fiction writers of earlier times like the late 19th century, early 20th century. This is an effort to take a modern perspective, put ourselves in the shoes of those envisioning the future, and project something fantastical and impossible. That's what steampunk is all about. It's a sort of retrofuturism, and that's what's embodied here. How influential has that been? Well, consider MB&F. Now, MB&F, of course, has had its horological machines. They represent extreme avant-garde. What they borrow from this watch is the idea that a watch at the ultra-high end of the watch market doesn't have to look like a watch. It could look like a computer. It could look like a spaceship. It could look like a 1950s turbine engine. It could look like any number of things. The form is no longer a constraint. But if you look at the MB&F legacy machines, not the horological machines, the idea, as Max Bousset, the principal of the brand, has described, Max Bousset has essentially said, this is the idea of a MB&F horological machine had it been built in the year 1890. What he's saying essentially is that he's borrowing the controlling idea of the Antiqua. He's taking a look to the future through the lens of the past, creating something that is essentially a steampunk execution like the Antiqua. And you can see every element of this watch is thoughtfully designed. It's incredibly expressive. It's incredibly different. Now this caliber 198 by Halter-Barnes, later Vianney Halter, represents an extreme mutation of the Longines L990, later Lemania 8810 and 8815 ultra-thin movements. Now there's sort of a sophomoric notion in the luxury watch community that if a watch is based on an Bausch, then it's not in-house, or it represents less artisanal skill than an in-house movement. Well, I can tell you that there are a lot of sub $5,000 watches today with rote derivative in-house movements. Yeah, they might be built under one roof, but there's nothing inspired or artisanal about them. Just to give you an idea of how dramatically Vianney Halter departed from the base movement, from the core genus, I'm going to show you a Geneva seal version of this caliber in a Roger Dubuis that's nearly unrecognizable. Now this is an elaborated version of the 8810, 8815, and this is the Vianney Halter version. Not only will you struggle to see the rotor at all in this case, but notice the way the bridges are cut to create the impression of a seamless, singular, unitary bridge. You certainly don't get that even on the Geneva seal caliber Roger Dubuis. Now this is an exceptional movement, but we're talking the difference between a revelation in finishing quality and an absolute revolution in a historic sense. This is in the finest traditions of Geneva, and this was the first in a new tradition. You'll also note the difference in size. Now, for the sake of giving scale, I'm going to show you the 46mm Roger Dubuis right next to the 40mm Antiqua, and you can see just how much bigger the 46 is. For that matter, I want to give you an even better sense of scale. When I emphasize the delicacy of this Halter-Barnes Antiqua, take a look at it next to my Master Ultra Thin. This is my own personal watch that I'm wearing today. Now that's a 34mm watch, and you can see this is anything but a monolithic monster. You compare the two watches, and yes, the Antiqua is larger, but it's not the size of something like a PAM 341 with multiple dials like you might fear when you first see it in one of those highly staged studio shots. On the wrist and in relation to another relatively petite timepiece, you can see that it's a gorgeous execution with traditional proportions but outrageous detailing innovation. Moving back to the detail of the case, I want to talk about elements that are decidedly retrofuturistic, namely the use of these white gold bolts throughout the construction. You can see them everywhere, from the crown itself, which features 24 inset white gold bolts, to all of the individual portholes, to the actual cover of the front of the watch. Now there are 104 of these little gold bolts on the entire timepiece, and I want to emphasize that every single one of them is functional and placed by hand. These are not simply polished to dimples molded onto the case. So the elements that make up the construction of the watch are exquisite in their intricacy as well as their hand-finished detail, and this is an entirely handmade watch. Now, Vianney Halter makes F.P. Journe look like Rolex. This watch was made in 1999. The first prototype was made in 1998. It's estimated that since 1998, Janvier SA, which is Vianney Halter's company, his small atelier in Switzerland, has produced perhaps as many watches, just under 1,000, as F.P. Journe builds yearly. If F.P. Journe is a micro-manufacturer, Vianney Halter's company represents something almost like the ancestral Swiss cottage industry that represents the foundation, the earliest sort of incipient variant of the Swiss watch industry of today. We're talking 19th century scales of production, perhaps appropriate given the subject matter. But all elements of the watch are thematically consistent. You can see those inset white gold bolts on the actual pin buckle itself on both sides. You can see the unique Halter-Barnes signage, and that deserves its own separate explanation because Jeff Barnes was the art design brains behind Vianney Halter's Antiqua. Debuted in 1998, it represented an artist's idea of what a high horology luxury watch could look like. That's why the complications, the perpetual calendar that you see here, the civil time, the day of the week, the day, the month, and the leap year cycle, as well as the date, that was all engineered and executed by Vianney Halter. The look of the watch was Jeff Barnes. The partnership did not last. Like other partnerships in high horology, you could cite something as fundamental as Wilsdorf and Davis, later becoming Rolex. The original partners don't necessarily stay with the company in the long term. Vianney Halter and Barnes had a falling out. Halter endured, persevered, made the watch economically viable, and continues to this day building a bare trickle of these per year. And the bottom line is, this is a true connoisseur's watch. For those who love something that's entirely handmade, it doesn't get any better than this. Consider the gold dials, every single one of them, hand-carved at Halter's atelier. That is, each individual feature, from the indices to the actual letters, all characters, the railroad or sector rehaut around the civil time, each of the applied gold elements bearing the HB and Halter-Barnes marquee, everything is hand-cut, and then all of the black features are actually individually filled with lacquer and then set, so they'll always be lustrous, they'll always be beautiful, and will never fade like a print. And it's worth mentioning that on top of these individually hand-carved and lacquered gold subdials, the hands themselves are literally handmade, pun intended. This is a company where every element was made and finished under one small roof. Just talking a little bit more about the art design and the execution, I want to talk about this mystery rotor on the case back. Now, it winds the watch, dual mainspring barrels according to the original Longines architecture, but you'd be hard-pressed to find them. The 35-hour power reserve motivates the Perpetual calendar and time displays, but this asymmetrically weighted but aesthetically symmetrical mystery rotor is actually borne by a crystal support that provides a link between the rotor center and the bearing and the outer weighted perimeter metal feature. So this is actually sort of an invisible rotor, almost like the mystery dials of the 1950. This is a mystery winding rotor, seamless, just like the bridges itself. It's almost a little bit of a magic eye type of feature. It beguiles endlessly, and it's a beautiful original innovation by Jeff Barnes and Vianney Halter that adds to the character of this watch, whether viewed from the back or the iconic front. And while this strap is slightly worn, I want to emphasize that it's a very important piece of the total package. This does have the imprint of Halter-Barnes on the back, and I understand that a number of these watches, when they go back to service at Janvier SA in Switzerland, have been retrofitted with Vianney Halter signage throughout, on the dial, the straps, the buckle itself. Now, I'm not going to weigh in on revisionist history, but for my money, if I want the ultimate historical artifact, the ultimate documentation of the dawn of an important chapter in modern era high horology, I want this as intact as possible. If you do ever send it back to Vianney, write a very carefully worded note. Retain everything, because this is a true historical document. Everything that you're going to see at SIHH and Basel World this year is going to be extraordinary by the standards of the early 90s, things that never could have been imagined. But you're going to note just how many of them embody the same expressionist, flamboyant, exuberant, over-the-top, sky's-the-limit design and complication ethic. A great deal of that can be traced to that original 1998 Antiqua, and this example, one of the Halter-Barnes first edition models, represents a rarity among rarities, a true connoisseur's piece, and one of the few undeniable modern-era investment-grade blue-chip timepieces that you can buy. I'm not one to tout a watch as an investment. This is going to be a rare exception where I have to call out a superb and significant example. And you can see it in high-resolution images on our website, watchyouwant.com.